The M1917, the first ever American tank. The American-built clone of the Renault FT and one of the few to never see combat, but used by pattern to crush a protest on the streets of Washington. Hello and welcome to Tank Talks, and let's dive right into some context. When the US entered the First World War in 1917, it was very unprepared. Its army was woefully under-equipped and outdated. Most importantly for this video, US had no tanks. Finding themselves staring at these tiny new weapons used by the British and the French, they wanted them. Problem was that there wasn't enough to arm their own armies, let alone to gift or sell to the US. They did loan some Mark I's and Renault FTs, but that is not owning them. Looking at all the tanks available at that moment, the US decided that the Renault FT was the perfect tank for them, being cheap and easier to produce than the others. Problem? There wasn't enough to arm the French couldn't sell them, but there was a solution. Acquire the license to produce it yourself. However, producing a licensed tank was not easy. They needed engines and other parts that were produced in France, not the US. Of course, the solution was to instead alter the design to include the locally manufactured parts, resulting in the creation of the light tank M1917. Light tank M1917 was a two-man American light tank that differed from the original in some minor things. Starting with the engine, it was unrealistic and frankly not worth it to acquire the license to produce the Renault 4-cylinder engine, leading to the decision to use the 42 horsepower Buda engine produced in Karabey, Illinois. These tanks were later upgraded into the A1 variant with the 100 horsepower Franklin engine produced by Franklin in Syracuse, New York. There were two main variants based on the armaments. The one with a cannon that had the 37mm M1916 main gun, which was a US-produced, licensed copy of the French Pitot gun. Machine gun-armed M1917s originally had a Marlin Rockwell M1917, which was later replaced by the legendary Browning M1919. On top of that, there were some minor changes with like the exhaust being on the opposite side, the idler wheel being made of solid steel instead of steel-rimmed wooden one, and also there are some minor changes in the armor, from the different gun mantlet, more vision slits, and other minor changes. As you can see, there's a whole lot that went into actually making this work, not to mention the fact that these documents had to be converted into imperial measurements to actually be able to work. On top of this, the three companies in charge of producing them, CL Best, Van Dorn Iron Works, and Maxwell Motor Company, had great issues coordinating with each other. So much so that more than 60 were produced before the First World War ended, with a handful arriving in Europe 9 days after the armistice. Overall, 950 were produced in total, with the machine gun variant being the most produced with around 526, then some 374 armed with a main gun, and there are some 50 with a fixed turret, fitted with a radio, meant as a command and signal variant. When it comes to military service, it never saw combat. It was used a few times to disperse riots within the US. For example, the Washington race riots of 1919, though the weather seemed to have been the one to truly disperse the riots. Same with the Lexington riots. Used for training otherwise, the next interesting part was when 5 was sent to the US Marine Expeditionary Force to Tianjin, China in April of 1927. Where they weren't recorded ever firing their guns and returning in late 1928. Starting in 1931, these tanks started to get phased out slowly over time. However, its next major point was in 1932, when the issue of the bonus army, the unemployed First World War veterans and their families and supporters, demanded the veterans get their promised payouts. Douglas MacArthur was given the task of dispersing the bonus army in Washington, D.C., and among the troops, 6 M1917 light tanks were deployed under the command of George Patton, and he never fired a shot at the protesters. These tanks started to be storaged and slowly scrapped, but when the Second World War rolled around, its final chance appeared. Entering the Second World War, the Canadians found themselves in need of tanks for training their soldiers, preparing them for eventually operating the British-made tanks. The US, seeing an opportunity, sold 250 M1917 tanks to Canada as scrap. removing the weapons and transporting them across the border, with them being used for training. Around 20 survived today. And that is all. Thank you all so much for watching, and see you all next time. Bozdra!